a lot of my friends, a lot of my grandmother's relatives, all of them were Nazarenes. My mother went to the Nazarene College when we had the Nazarene College here. And my grandpa gave the land, I think, for the Nazarene Church. And a lot of my cousins, they went to a convention at BB. And they, like all other churches, they got in arguments and feuds and fusses. And two of the brothers came home and started the Methodist Church here in Vilonia. That's part of the history of the church. They were kin to me. In other words, it goes back that if you, my mother also had or my family's got a handwritten diary of when they were going to California and they stopped over at Mountain Springs because my grandpa, brother, and his wife were having a baby, and he was 10-year old. And they couldn't go on with the wagon train, so they got off at Mountain Springs. And that's how my family came to live in Vilonia. My history is like this. In other words, I was born in Vilonia, lived here all my life. My mother and daddy was born here, and my folks came here in a covered wagon and settled over at Mountain Springs. They lived there one summer, and then they moved down to 16th section, and then the next year they moved over. They moved to Vilonia, and my great-grandparents lived here. My mother was born here, and my great-grandparents had the farm where Don Scroggins has got. Preston lives right over here, off of Marshall Road. I attended church here some when I was about 6 years old, 7, and then my mother and daddy. My mother and daddy. My dad didn't have to go to the army because he had so many people to take care of. My grandma and grandpa lived with us, and so my mother and daddy, when they had 3 children, and there was 2, me and my sister, and both of my grandparents were disabled, couldn't work. And so he got deferred from the army. Now we're talking about the Second World War. He got deferred from the army because he had so many dependents. Back then there was no Social Security or no nothing. In other words, you had to feed your parents or they starved. So my dad we had cotton like everybody else back then, and he had a bad cotton crop, and he left and went to California, and he welded in the shipyards in California, and he came back and got my mom, and she got a job and went to California, and she welded in the shipyards. My mother and daddy both welded in the shipyards in California. During that time, I lived with my grandparents, and my grandmother was a devout Nazarene, and there was no question about kids, about whether we go to church or not. If we were breathing and didn't have a fever, we went to church with grandmother. And that's where I met the Lord. I was saved in the Nazarene church. And to make a long story short, then I was going here until I started living with my grandmother. Then I missed a few years coming to the Methodist church here. Me and my wife, I went in service. First I went to school. I graduated to university and got married and went in the Army all the same year, 1955. came home in '57. I served my 2 years. I was drafted. So I served my 2 years in the Army. I came home in '57, and my wife and I wanted to go to church somewhere. She was a Baptist, and I was a Nazarene. So we went to the different churches in Vilonia, and we settled on the Methodist Church. I was, so in '57, we joined the Methodist Church, 1957. We had 2 boys, and she worked in the church a lot with the kids and everything. And in fact, I guess for 10 or 15 years, she mowed the yard here. And at that time, we had a parsonage and all. And but anyway, we of course, she died in 2017. My wife died, and so we've been members she was a member all her life, the rest of her life, and I've, of course, good Lord, still putting up with me. But anyway, when I first started going to church here, go back a minute. First started going to church here, it was in the old church, and the old church, of course, was open like this building here, and we had wires, and the women put up sheets and all, and made classrooms for the different Sunday school classes. And then I was about somewhere they had already built the second church. I'll never forget, we had men back then, when they came to church, they all kind of gathered outside on Sunday morning, and there'd be 15 or 20 men standing outside. We had Mr. Dallas, we called him Steve Dallas. And Mr. Dallas, as we were adding on to the church, Mr. Dallas said, we'd come up, and he said, "Men," said, "I've got to have $1 from you this morning." He said, "I just want $1, that's all I want." Every Sunday morning, he'd say, "I'm ready for that $1, boys." We had to give him $1. And somebody said, "Mr. Dallas, why do you have to have this $1? He said, "Well, we're making an addition to this church, and we're going to have an indoor bathroom. And we're not going to have to go to this little house out back anymore." He said, "I'm going to use this money to build a bathroom in our new church, in a new addition." Then they put on an addition, and then there was another addition added to that. And so it was in 3 different phases that building committee went through all that. Well, I want to go back in just a minute and say that I was a teacher here for many years in Sunday school. I've met a lot of wonderful people that have gone on. And one thing that I would like you hear people say, "Well, I hope I get to go to heaven." He said, "Don't say that. Say, I'm going to go to heaven." And that stuck with me. I think that's a wonderful thing. Don't have to hope. I know where I'm going. I'm going to go to heaven. And one reason, let me tell you this. The reason I love to come to church is I think we all need to learn how to be good disciples, and we all need our battery charged. I've got a friend that says if you don't go to church, you don't get your battery charged. We all need our battery charged, and we all need to be good disciples. I want to love everybody.